Okay, cool. We made it. Whew. Now we can do a hard pivot to the arterial vasculature of the central nervous system. This is, I mean, strokes just in terms of like clinical relevance. Strokes of the first or the fourth leading cause of death, depending on how you look at them. And even if death isn't an issue, I mean, it's still like a tremendous quality of life impact. And so it's just a tremendous burden on our healthcare system. It's really important we understand strokes. Also very highly tested. But to understand strokes, it really helps if you understand the basic geography of everything. So I'm a nerd. We've been through this, but like one last example. I watched Game of Thrones. It was amazing. My girlfriend had never watched Game of Thrones, so I rewatched the whole thing with her. And she was having trouble, or maybe I was just being a little bit too like paternalistic and demanding. Maybe she was having trouble following, and so I bought a blackboard wallpaper and put it up in my living room. All my roommates hated it. It was a huge eyesore. And so every time we'd watch, I would draw a map of Westeros and Essos, Eastros, so that we could know where everything was and kind of like map out the battles and where King's Landing was relative to everything. It's probably super annoying, and she probably put up with it because she liked me, but like, yeah, I would make the argument that it made the show a lot easier to follow if you kind of knew where everything was. Same thing with strokes. If you know where the arteries are, it's easier to figure out like the immediate proximity of what's going to be affected. So without further ado, let's get into it. So we have anterior circulation of the brain with the ICA, and then we have the posterior circulation of the brain with the vertebrobasilar artery. So this is kind of what the whole picture is going to look like, and we're gonna build up everything, and it's hopefully all going to come together. So here's the ICAs. The vertebral arteries are going to again combine to the basilar. So this is going to be the posterior aspect, and this is going to be the anterior aspect. So let's watch this fun little movie. Again, just keep in mind the carotids are going to be the anterior side, and the vertebral is going to go to the posterior side, where they eventually converge to make the basilar. So we're starting in the aortic arch. And we have the brachiocephalic over here on the left, immediately the common carotid to the anterior portion, subclavian real quick, followed by the vertebral. All right, here's the subclavian to the vertebral, and the common carotid here is actually just coming straight off the aortic arch. I don't think that's that important. Main takeaway is this. Okay, so the common carotids are going to branch to form the external carotid artery, which is going to supply the face, and the internal carotid, which is the one important for our purposes, to supply the brain. And then the vertebral arteries in the posterior aspect, and here kind of on the medial side that we're looking at, it's going to penetrate through the transverse foramen of these cervical vertebrae. So let's watch another fun little movie. I thought of it as like threading the needle when you're trying to like get through these tiny little foramen. Common carotid, external, as promised, internal, and boom, carotid sinus for the glossopharyngeal nerve, and then the vertebral. Cool. Lateral below the head, you don't want to get here. This is where we have our middle meningeal artery. If this ruptures, you get epidermal hematoma, which is not a good thing. It comes off of the maxillary artery, which is itself a branch of the external carotid. So let's take a look. So we're starting here. So here's the internal, here's the vertebral, and right now we're highlighting the external. Let's take a look. External goes to maxillary. Maxillary goes to middle meningeal. We're taking away, remember there's two dural layers. We're taking the cranial dural layer. Right under that is the meningeal dural layer. And that is where we have our middle meningeal artery. So if you have this rupture, it is still technically outside the dural layer, hence epidural. It's outside the meningeal dural layer, which is the important one. Now the internal carotid is going to enter the brain through the carotid canal. But it actually has a really complicated trajectory as it moves up. So it goes through the carotid canal. It's going to make a hard, like 90-degree turn or 70-degree turn or whatever. It's going to start moving like medially rather than superiorly. Let's get it from another picture. So same thing. So you can kind of see it over here, right? It's going up and then it kind of just takes a sharp turn. Here, boom, right? So it's coming in through here and then suddenly it's traveling this way. And we see that again here. It's going here, goes here, and then it goes right up again. So right when it pokes its head up like a groundhog on Groundhog's Day, it's going to poke its head up right into the cavernous sinus. And this is kind of interesting. This is the only time like an artery is ever like in a venous structure. So that's kind of interesting. The cavernous sinus is interesting in general just because we have a lot of like ophthalmic nerve and the oculomotor nerve and the trochlear nerve and whatnot are moving through it. So it moves up through that. And there we go. That's a fun little ghosting picture. And okay, enough of that. Meanwhile, in the Legion of Doom, so the vertebral columns are now on the posterior side. We've threaded the needle through the transverse foramen of the cervical vertebrae, and now they are moving up through the foramen magnum. Very cool. And all right, so once they get a little bit higher, we're going to have this offshoot, and this is going to be the anterior spinal artery, which supplies the medial medulla. Not shown, but it supplies the medial medulla. You can see that over here, and that is going to supply the as the name implies, anterior spinal artery is supplying the anterior spinal cord. What tract is there that's relevant? We're dealing with the spinothalamic tract is going to be the relevant one. So right before they merge into the basilar artery, they are going to have offshoots, which are the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. This is really highly prone to strokes. It's going to be Wallenberg syndrome, which we'll talk about. But so again, pica is going to be the part of the cerebellum, but also more importantly, the lateral medulla. All right, so now we go. Hooray! They've joined. Union. They've merged as one. Right? It's a beautiful ceremony. Now we have the basilar. Right after that, we have another thing. So we have the pica, then it became the basilar. Now it's the AICA, anterior inferior cerebellar artery. It's going to supply a little bit more superior on the cerebellum, but it's going to supply more importantly, the lateral pons. Where we continue up, we have the basilar artery, and then shooting off the basilar artery are the pontine arteries. And so here we have the basilar artery, and here we have the pontine artery. So they're both going to be supplying like the medial pons for the most part. And again, this geography is really important so that you can identify what the stroke symptoms will be. I always thought that this kind of looked like the little face hugger thing from the Alien movies. So I looked up SCA. SCA, there are so few strokes of the SCA that when I Googled it, I could not find a good picture. This is like the best picture I found. And that just kind of underscores like this isn't that important of one. It looks like it was drawn with an etchy sketch, but this is mostly just implying the cerebellum, really not any of the brainstem structures. And this is just more fun cerebellum hot pics. There's a cerebellum. There's a cerebellum from another angle. Beautiful. Being supplied by the SCA, AICA, and PICA. PICA, AICA, SCA. All right, so now at the end of the basilar artery, we're going to have the PCAs, posterior cerebral artery, branching off. These are going to supply the occipital lobe, which is important for vision. They're also going to supply the midbrain, the entire midbrain, the medial and the lateral aspect. Note, though, and we're going to come back to this, that the occipital lobe has also is vasculature from the middle cerebral artery. So it's got a dual supply, at least the part of the occipital lobe that supplies the central or macular vision. So if you have a PCA stroke or an MCA stroke, the central vision will probably be spared. It's probably an evolutionary thing because it's just such an important thing to have central vision that, maybe evolution naturally selected for people whose arterial blood supply like kind of overlapped, right? There's a Venn diagram of the MCA and PCA for the macular region. Anywho, so now we're looking at the PCA, and we have these posterior communicating arteries branching off of this. The posterior communicating, anytime we see it communicating, there's very high likelihood that we might see a bari or saccular aneurysm there. If these bust, we get these subarachnoid hemorrhages, and at the posterior cerebral artery, this is going to be right around the superior aspect of the pons, the superior aspect of the midbrain. We know that cranial nerve 3 is hanging out. So in other words, if you have a bari aneurysm of the PCOM, it could damage cranial nerve 3, and you'll have this down and out pupil. Probably with constricted pupil, down and out eye with constricted pupils. All right, return of the internal carotid artery. We did the posterior. We're back to the anterior. Let's see what's going on. So, the ACA, anterior cerebral artery, is going to branch off from the internal carotid, and there's going to be, there's a little tiny anterior communicating artery between them. The communicating arteries is all about like collateral blood flow, right? If there's an infarction over here, well, that's okay. Like maybe some of this blood flow can be diverted over there and then make its way back over there. So a lot of collateral blood flow. And again, we have another place where we could have a Barry aneurysm. What could be compressed now? Well, this is the sella turcica. That's where the pituitary goes, and that is near the optic chiasm. So you could get a bitemporal vision loss, which we'll get into. And then the MCA, which is probably the most important artery. This is the most common stroke site, and this is going to be you're going to have contralateral loss of the arms and face. So you could also have a Barry aneurysm here in addition to the MCA just having an ischemic, embolic, hemorrhagic, whatever type stroke. And again, this whole thing is the circle of Willis. Circle is supposed to be a circle like that. I think it looks a little bit more like a cyclopentane, but it's all about collateral flow. So that if there's kind of an infarction or hemorrhagic incident in one part, the blood can be redistributed to try to save as much brain tissue as possible from an ischemic death. And so, we had ADCOM, PCOM, and also the MCAs where we might see these Barry aneurysms. This one is the optic chiasm because we see that's where the pituitary is. Just, and this is going to be, I'm just trying to stress this because it's really high yield to know about pituitary tumors and compressing in the eye, optic chiasm. And then the PCOM is going to, as we said, could damage cranial nerve 3, the oculomotor nerve. Remember that there is the cranial nerve 3 is on the inside and the PNS is on the outside. So ischemia would deprive cranial nerve 3 before the parasympathetic nervous system, and a tumor is going to damage the parasympathetic nervous system before it gets cranial nerve 3. But it could easily get both. It often will get both. There we go. Here's this beautiful animation that I made, and another beautiful animation at the PCOMs getting the optic chiasm and the oculomotor. You can see it right there. All right, so the MCA has these tiny little branches that feed deep into the subcortical regions of the basal ganglia, and these are particularly prone to susceptible to damage from hypertension. So if you have hypertension, you get an ischemic stroke. The hypertension, and other things as well, like lipohyalinosis and microatheromas, are going to lead to these lacunar infarcts. A lacunar infarct for lenticular striate ischemic stroke. And then an aneurysm from a Charcot-Bouchard is also associated with hypertension. So very much hypertension with the lenticular striate, which is a branch of the MCA, which supplies the basal ganglia. ACA is going to go right here above the corpus callosum. Right there above the corpus callosum, it's easy. MCA is going to go right along this little sylvian fissure, this lateral fissure, and supply the lateral. It's going to apply a slightly larger region, but for the most part, just the lateral side of the brain, of the cortex. We can see it there, and we can see it there. Again, that's all MCA right there. Okay, so this is important when we think about the MCA and ACA when we think about this with regards to the homunculus. So remember that the medial portion is going to be the legs, and the lateral portion is going to be more the face and upper extremities. So if we look at this, the ACA right here is the medial portion, and that gets everything here, which is going to be a bunch of kind of leg structures. And then we get the MCA, which is going to be on the lateral side. That is what it's supplying. And that's going to be more of the face and the arms and fingers and whatnot. Okay, so we're looking at the PCA, right? So this is the PCA. We said it supplies the entire midbrain, both the lateral and medial part, but it's also, and probably most importantly, supplying the occipital lobe. But again, this region right here, which is where we might have the the part of the occipital lobe that processes the macular vision, has some coming from the posterior cerebral artery, but also a little bit coming from the middle cerebral artery. There is this, right here, there's a little bit of collateral circulation there. Maybe not collateral circulation, I don't know if that's the right term, but it can feed from the left artery to the right artery, right? So if there's an infarct in one, it's going to be spared usually. All right, this is a really great summary. I love this picture. So I did not make this. So the vertebral arteries coming out from the posterior side are going to make the anterior spinal artery, which gets the anterior part of the spine, but it gets the medial medulla. The pica and the aeca, these are both going to be lateral, so I'll just commit that to memory. So it's going to be, the pica is going to be the lateral medulla, and the aeca, medulla always means deepest, right? When you look cortex always means the outside of medulla always means deepest in anatomy. So it's always know that the medulla is the deepest. So pica is going to be the medulla. Aeca is going to be the lateral pons. The basal artery and the pontine arteries, the little face hugger thing, is going to be the medial pons. The SCA doesn't really do much. It's the cerebellum. These are all technically cerebellum, so I would know that. The SCA very rarely strokes, hence that etch-a-sketch picture we saw. PCA is going to be the medial and lateral midbrain. MCA is going to be the lateral cortex. which is going to be the face and the arms, and the ACA is going to be right above the corpus callosum, which just gets the medial cortex, which is going to be the legs of the homunculus. This is really just a picture. This is a more complicated but more more accurate depiction of how everything looks and how everything's arranged. I would be very familiar with it. One thing we didn't talk about is that the ophthalmic artery, which becomes the retinal artery, comes right off of the internal carotid artery.